It was a typical Boy Scout campout for adolescent boys. With one exception, my good friend Paul Sears and I decided to take a little hike in the last hours of the camp along the river. Paul had just fashioned a nice walking stick and we made strides down the trail, and there was a snake in the pathway. And Paul almost instinctively just hit that snake and it rolled over. And he was ready to hit it again. And I said, "No, Paul, don't kill it." I gently lifted it up and turned it over. It had a little skinned, a little bleeding, but I wrapped it in my Boy Scout kerchief and took it home. When I got home, I put a little W.T. Raleigh ointment on it, put a Band-Aid around it, and for the next few weeks I fed it and nurtured it, and we began to have a relationship. Now, I should have let it go in the wild, but I'd been collecting a lot of critters, and so I had a cage there in my bedroom, and we began to share things, and I could take it outside, and play with it and so on. And I know, I could not expect from a reptile to have the same sort of emotions and relationships as mammals do, as dogs and cats and horses, but we had a bond, and I felt we were communicating. So the time came to name it. Well, I was watching it change. It had brown and gray spots, but there as it matured, it began to turn all black, and I realized it was an immature black snake. And so I thought, it's time for a name as it was going through its life transition. And I wanted to call it Black Snake, but I shortened it to BS. Now I could have chosen, chosen the scientific name, but that was too complicated. And also they go as black rat snake, and I didn't want that. So Black Snake or BS was its name. And it was great. We were developing, it had some natural abilities that were very helpful. I got mice in the chicken house, and it would climb trees with me. And I found there were other things I could do. In fact, it was responding to me, it was communicating. I could whistle and it would come back to me. So I could take it out in the woods or in the grass, and of course it wanted to do some of its own hunting. Maybe it had a female friend out there too, but it whistled. And he would come back, and I had a little knapsack that I carried it. So we would take hikes and adventures, and back home I worked out a little obstacle course for it. And I thought about maybe entering him in a contest, or maybe get in the record book for the most tricks that one could teach a snake. Although I'm not sure, was I training the snake, or was BS just becoming a part of the confinement and adjusting to his new environment? But nevertheless, over the next months and into the second year, we were having a great relationship. But I'm particularly grateful. We were taking a hike, and I slipped and fell down into a brushy ravine, all the way down, sprained my ankle. I couldn't get up. And BS slipped out of his knapsack, went up on the trail, and waited for hikers to come, got their attention, crawled back down. As they looked, they spotted me, and I yelled and got their attention. He saved my life. So now things were a little more in balance. It prompted me to do a little bit of research on the relationship between human beings and snakes. That's been important over the years, and biblical heritage, you understand. From the very beginning in Hebrew text, the serpent was the wisest of all the creatures. And of course, Jesus instructed his followers to be wise as serpents. And the serpents have been, of course, a symbol of healing, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness and folks were healed. And of course, not to mention all of the snake oil, the medicinal qualities of certain venoms. And of course, it becomes the symbol of the medical profession, you understand. So wisdom and healing were a part of that relationship that I began to understand as he and I began to communicate. And what I noticed was he was now responding to yes and no questions. And I noticed too that he was very defensive when strangers came. He would tighten up real tight, kind of hiss, and he would rattle his tail, which black snakes do, simulate somewhat what the rattlesnakes do. And I began to realize that he was protecting me, that there was that strength of relationship. Well, it so happened at about that time, I had gotten interested in exploring the storm sewers of our city. And I couldn't get very many of my friends to go with me. You know, sometimes it was small, sometimes it was larger, but BS would go with me. And we'd take the flashlight and the knapsack, and then he would be on his own. And there were 2 to 3 miles of storm sewers, and I knew how to get in at the side of the street or get a manhole covered up, and I knew everywhere how to get in, how to get out. It was a wonderful time of exploration. And wouldn't you know it, we got into a nest of black widow spiders. And BS ate them all. Once again, saved my life. That bond was becoming so. I just, what I couldn't understand was why people are so fearful and afraid of snakes. Is it competition? Is it jealousy? But what I found was, again, that bond was so important, and now it was going on 2 years. He was still comfortable in the knapsack, even though he'd gotten up over 5 feet long and weighed about 3 pounds. But he would get in, and I'd whistle, he would come, and he would get in, and we would go places. Well, it so happened at that time, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were putting a dam on the river, creating a Harlan County Reservoir. And they were moving people out of the floodplain, and one town was moving a mile away up on the hills, leaving behind the streets and the storm sewers. I thought, I need to get out there and get that adventure, because they were planning to build a marina and some fishing cabins and so on. And if I was going to explore those storm sewers, you know, BS and I were there. We started our adventure and, you know, climbing around and squeezing. And we got up sort of the north end of where the town was, and there was a stone wall. And I removed some of the stones and we slipped through, and rather than crawling through the storm sewers, we walked into a cavern. These were human crafted caverns, and I began to find artifacts and carvings and pottery. This was a place where ancient indigenous people had spent time. And there were murals and paintings on the wall, carvings and paintings, and I began to recognize them. There were people dressed up in feathers and dancing before the great plumed serpent, the feathered serpent. Now, I was used to snake handlers in southern Appalachia, but what I was looking at was Mesoamerica, Central America, the ancients, the Maya, the Olmec, who worshiped the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of wisdom and knowledge, storm and wind. And I was just sort of mesmerized by the whole scene here, and realized, where's Blacksnake? He's gone. In this kind of temperature, he'll go dormant, and this is not good. And I searched and finally found him, and he had curled up in a little earthenware bowl on a shelf underneath one of those murals of Quetzalcoatl. I whistled, he wouldn't come. I reached up and he hissed at me. He did not want to leave. I left. As I came out of the cave and out of the storm sewers, the bulldozers were already there creating this new marina and community, and I left him behind because I understood. He had found a world where snakes were appreciated, were sacred, were honored, were respected, and I left him there. Now, I have not told the story of the last days of Blacksnake until now. But I go back to that spot and I look over the river, and I remember with fondness of how BS made my life memorable.